Welcome to this Kuali Days session. We're going to be talking about best practices for transformative implementation. I'm Ashley Pendergrass, a customer success manager with Kuali. I'll be serving as the host for this session. We're glad you're able to join us. Throughout this session, please enter your questions into the Q&A feature, which is separate from the chat feature. We're going to monitor the questions as we go and address those throughout the session. All attendees are going to be on mute throughout the session, and the session will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be available after the conference. So I'm going to turn the time over to our presenter, Colleen Bigelow, Director of Customer Success.
Perfect. Thank you, Ashley. So many of you might already know me. I've done a couple of sessions, and I know I've seen quite a few names that are in the attendee list on Monday and on Tuesday yesterday. So I'm Colleen Bigelow. I oversee the customer success team for the student team at Kuali, and I'm super, super excited. We're on day 3. So glad to have been able to connect with some of you, and so happy to have gotten some interactions and whatnot with you in our sessions and in socio and whatnot. All right, so if you've been to my other sessions, you know that I typically like to have an agenda. So I did split this into 3 parts. This session is shorter than my Monday session, so it's going to be a little bit quicker. But these are the 3 things that I would like to focus on for our session today. And to begin with, I want to ask the group a question, and you can pop this into the chat. You can feel free to just pop in your comments. I'm reading them as they come in. But have any of you ever taken a sip of milk only to discover that it wasn't milk, it was orange juice? Or maybe it was vice versa. Maybe you went to take a sip of orange juice and you got a big old gulp of milk instead. I don't know about you, but I've done this and I absolutely hate it. It's the worst, right? You know, and I love both milk and orange juice, but really, expectations are everything. And whether you're in paradise or you're receiving a postcard from paradise depends on what your expectations were, right? When you're expecting orange juice and you get orange juice, you're in heaven. It's perfect. It's exactly what you wanted. When you're expecting milk and you get milk, you're a happy camper. But flip those and immediately your face scrunches up. You're just unhappy with what you've received because it was not what you expected. Expectation management is a fancy way of saying that a project manager has a very clear view of the project's overall scope, the goals that we have, the timelines, to help the team successfully meet the project goal within the given parameters and constraints throughout the entire process. And it's important for both the project manager and project team to understand the ultimate goal destination. So I promise we weren't just talking about orange juice and milk because I love them both. I promise it did relate. All right, so in all of the implementation projects that Ashley and I have managed, we almost always hear something like, we want to improve our curriculum management process and make it more efficient whenever we ask for what the team's goal is. But what does that mean really, right? Is this less time that you're spending on approving proposals? Is this less effort, less resources required to manage your curriculum? Is it less complexity, confusion, frustration around the entire process? My assumption is that it's all of these things, but I think it's really important to understand some specifics. So when starting implementation for curriculum management, it really is important that we're establishing the present or the now or the current state of your situation, right? Making sure that we understand that whole process to create a new course or to update an existing course, and those pain points that your team is really feeling, and then establish the future state to fully understand where we're at, where we're going, and what we need to get there, because that really affects how we tailor the project plan, how we tailor the forms that we're building to make sure that we're accommodating for what you're experiencing now, what you really want, based on those pain points and that destination that you described to us. Additionally, I think it's incredibly important for us to understand any constraints that may exist. And majority of the time, things like resource constraints come up very, very early on for us. If you're implementing a new learning management system, or you're implementing a new student information system, or making updates or anything like that, it's pretty typical, and it's highly encouraged that you do let us know about this early on so that we can plan for that. It affects the schedule and our discussions about, hey, we're heading into the section where we need your help from this team. Is that going to be a problem? Should we schedule around that? Some constraints come up naturally and early on like this, while others take a bit to surface. And in all honesty, some constraints come up as we progress through implementation. But either way, it's super important for us to note these things. And it's been very helpful, I've noticed, in the implementations that I'm running, when the implementation team gives me insight into things that I normally wouldn't get, or I might stumble upon later on my own. But having that insight ahead of time helps me navigate a little bit better. Things like, the politics across the different teams that we're working with, letting me know, hey, they're really stressed. They went through some layoffs. Culture there is really rough. It helps me understand and empathize and approach them in a certain way, rather than just going in kind of eyes blind to what may be going on in their world. So I just want to make that note. If you're starting implementation with us, whether it's to implement a CM, from the start, or if you are approaching a new project with us, whether that's to do a review of your forms, or make some massive changes to your forms, or add a form, or change your workflow, just give us that heads up. Let us know what's going on. Because these are all important factors for our team to understand and to establish the ultimate goal that we are setting with you. All right, so that's part one, super easy. Just wanted to talk about expectations to make sure that's something that we're all kind of on the same page about when it comes to implementation with our team, specifically for curriculum management. The next two things that I do want to talk about are process improvement and change management. And I like to call these two out very specifically. It's obvious process improvement is going to come up in implementation no matter what, because you told us you want to improve your curriculum management process. And so we know by default, there are going to be some things, some processes that you'd like to improve. And so, of course, this is going to come up. However, because you're changing processes that affect so many people, you really should be considering change management as well. And I feel as though too often change management is kind of brushed aside, or even left unaddressed until the very last minute, right before launching, which is unfortunate, because I feel as though, in all my experiences here at Kuali and at other companies, or as part of an implementation team, the most successful implementations are always the ones that are looking to obtain user buy-in as they are making the changes to improve the entire system and process for those end users, right? What good is making these changes if the end users are not bought into it? So let's dive in a little bit more into process improvement specifically. So there are two sides of the process improvement coin that should be considered when implementing change management and maybe even catalog. And those two things are efficiencies that can be gained by simply moving to the product, right? Just simply moving to this platform, immediately we gain these efficiencies, versus efficiencies that are actually gained by going in and reviewing and changing existing processes, or maybe even building new processes that don't exist. So when you're thinking about the efficiencies that are gained by moving to curriculum management, these are things like you're coming off of paper-based processes, right? You're printing out things. Immediately, you're going to gain an efficiency because you don't have to do that anymore, and things are all housed within CM, or curriculum management. Other things like multiple platforms or multiple applications to achieve your curriculum management process. Immediately, again, that's something that is likely going to be an efficiency that you gain very, very quickly because you're going to be consolidating those platforms and applications, right? So instead of using SharePoint for this point or for this piece of your curriculum management and using, print-based things or using Google folders or Google Docs, you're going to be able to kind of consolidate all of that into hopefully one program, one application, and that's, CM. And then additionally, things like asynchronous reviews, right? So it may be that in your process, you are required to have a committee meet every so often, maybe every month or every 3 weeks or something like that, in order to go through all of those printed copies or those proposals that have been submitted to the committee. And CM has a lot of functionality that allows you to kind of bypass these things, especially the new feature that we recently released with comments, right? So there's a little bit more that you can do asynchronously by telling a committee or group, hey, you have these 3 proposals, or you have this handful of proposals that need to be reviewed, and you need to make your comments by X date, in which case, decision will be made and we'll reconvene to go over the comments. And so all of that is housed within CM by default in the product, right, for you to go back and review. So these asynchronous reviews are even better supported now because you have a record of it to refer back to. When considering efficiencies that are gained by changing processes, these are likely the things that we're talking to you about in terms of, removing duplicate or unnecessary approval steps and standardization. And so it really depends on how you're approaching this implementation with us, right? We have varying degrees of how much change is possible when we implement CM. But these are things where we're walking through, we're building your forms, and we're realizing, gosh, we are asking the same question 4 times in the same form. Why are we doing this? This is extra work for, the proposer as well as any reviewers to look through, and it's just making the proposal so incredibly long. And then with the standardization, I think this comes up in every single implementation that we have, where there's this realization of, well, this department calls it, X, and this other department calls it Y, and there's a lot of variation between how we gather this information, how we review it. And so I think every single implementation group that we've worked with, we have this moment of, okay, let's talk about this. Let's talk about how we can standardize this and make this more, make this more similar across the board for our institutions, so that it's not so wildly different across our institution. And I will say that we found that the institutions that are able to change their processes efficiently really have, either the people or the committees or the groups designated to review changes and make those decisions. And I will often say that these committees usually already have some kind of recurring meeting separately from the meeting with us. That way, those topics that come up from the implementation check-in meetings with us that say, this doesn't make sense. Why don't we change this? Can we standardize these 2 forms and combine them into one? And that goes into that, other recurring meeting that this committee or this group has where they can make those decisions. And I do feel as though by having that, I know it seems like common sense, it seems very straightforward, but we see implementation goes far more smoothly and far more quickly, right? Rather than, I've worked with institutions where either that group is not designated, or they're not available, or they're not meeting regularly. And so we want to make changes because we don't want to build, bad practices or bad old habits that, used to exist in the old system into this new system. We want to start afresh. We want to start on the right foot in CM. And if we can't get those changes approved, it really slows us down, right? It can add an extra month because we're just waiting to find out if these things can be approved. So in an ideal world, we can make all the decisions and we can implement all the changes immediately. But we live in a reality. But in this reality, I think we can get as close to that ideal world if the right people and teams are, designated, available, and dedicated to these process changes, just like the implementation team is. All right, I'm going to pause, see if there's any comments, see if there's any questions, anything that we need to address so far. Okay, I'm going to keep us going. All right, so digging in a little deeper into those process changes for CM specifically, there are a few things that we highly encourage that you and your implementation team consider. Just like I mentioned before, that duplication in whether it's in your form or it's across forms or it's in your processes like your workflow and approval steps. Take note of these things, and as we build them in implementation, we will also take note of them and bring them up. You know, I'm working with an institution now, and we were building out their course form, which spanned across multiple forms, and I was consolidating that into one form and asked them, you know, you ask this way for undergrad, and then you ask a really similar question for the graduate side, but they seem almost the same. Is there any reason that they're not standardized, that you don't use the same answers or require the same type of information? And they said, no, it's just always been this way. And so let us, you know, figure out what we'd like to do to standardize this. And it was actually a very quick thing because that team was able to hash that out very quickly on that call. And so we eliminated several questions like that to make it into, you know, far less, half the number of either forms or half the number of fields on the form. So standardizing the curricular terminology and vocabulary, this is something that we've run into quite a bit with our institutions, making sure that across the board, end users and even within the implementation team, they understand what we're referring to when we say certain words, right? Whether things are called a division or a school, department, college, that's been something that we, you know, run into pretty frequently. And so I will say this, when implementation institutions come to us, and if they have all of these things nailed down beforehand, implementation goes a lot quicker. That being said, if you don't, you know, we're going to ask you to discuss this and to find a way to standardize this and make sure that there is also a way that this populates down to your end users and doesn't just kind of, you know, stay and sit with the project group. So reviewing organizational hierarchies and developing consistency across the technologies, this is something that often comes up, just like I mentioned, those divisions and those groups and whatnot. We'll find that sometimes, oh, well, this program reports to these two schools, even though everything else only reports to one school. And so we start to find these kind of weird things. And, you know, just this last week, I was working with another institution and we discussed this and we said, oh, this one's weird. Maybe we need to build something custom for this one program that is different from all the rest, only to find out that actually in their SIS, it didn't follow what they had thought, this exception. It had actually followed the rules that we had set up in CM. And so that was a moment of uncovering and realizing that there was confusion and there was a misunderstanding about how the reporting and hierarchy actually operated across their institution. And Paul made a comment, and I think it's really true. Defining, you know, what a program means, it can be challenging. But you know, when you're coming into a new application, you really don't want to be building those bad habits or those unclear objects or expectations about something. And so it's really important that you do sit down as a team and figure that out so that we start off, like I said, on the right foot within curriculum management. Paul, thanks for the interaction. I appreciate the input. Seriously, I would love to hear more from all of you. All right, so other things to consider when you're implementing curriculum management, or even if you're doing a review, progressive disclosure is incredibly valuable, incredibly powerful. Ashley will probably go into this a little bit more in her session right after this, and we also reviewed this in our Monday pre-conference session. But you know, progressive disclosure allows you to consolidate forms. It customizes the view for the user so that they're not overwhelmed with so many different things that they need to fill out, and they're not having to fill out a form and then go somewhere else to fill out another form. So highly powerful. If you're scheduled to do a review, I would consider progressive disclosure and see, oh, could I hide this and then reveal this later based on a specific answer that the user gives in this form to make it, you know, consolidated and easier to read. I think many of you who are already implemented know this very well. We always encourage using the rich text editor instead of just plain text. Especially for those of you who have come maybe from a place where you weren't able to organize data very well, but this allows users to organize things in a much more legible or readable format, right? So if I have to make a list of the course topics or the textbooks or resources that should be used or can be used for a specific course, it's much easier to read that and view that and consume it when it can be formatted with bullets, bolding, things like that, rather than just blah, a bunch of text kind of in my face. And then leveraging the option types, we've gone over option types quite a bit. The option types are things that you can configure as an admin, and then you can use that option in multiple forms or in multiple places. And then when you need to update it, I think one of the examples that I gave was campuses, right? So if a campus changes, if the name changes, or you get rid of a campus or add a new campus location, you update that once in the option type settings, and then it proliferates to the rest of the forms that are using that option. So very, very powerful, very strongly encourage that you can use option types where it makes sense. All right. And then planning for future process reviews. So for those who are new or in implementation, I know this probably seems very far off because you're essentially doing a process review right now by implementing. But for those of you who have been implemented and are live and have been live for a little while, it's good to plan those future process reviews, have them scheduled. Let us know if you want us to be involved to help out with that, to discuss especially the new features, right? So as we continue to develop new features, it may be that we need to take a look at how your form is operating and how you're collecting data and those pain points that you're having now, and then adjusting, making plans to incorporate some new features, or maybe approach that specific pain point in a specific way that we never have before. Because maybe things have changed. And so we highly encourage that you plan those process reviews. Let us know if we can help, if we can join you. And for those of you who are on my community session yesterday, post these in the community, get people talking about it, get advice from other institutions who may be running into the same thing, or maybe have run into the same issue, but resolved it in a different way that we just, maybe you or I haven't thought of yet. All right. Okay, so I want to switch gears a little bit when talking about process and process improvement while implementing CM. And I kind of want to talk about alignment, team alignment. And I'll tell you very frankly that for us, it is much easier to work with institutions who are aligned from the get-go. If your team is actively working towards alignment to get on the same page and come to a consensus, also a lot easier for us to work with. Teams that aren't aligned or aren't actively working to become aligned result in a far slower implementation. And I feel this is true about a lot of concepts for project management or change management, but this is common sense, but I think it's worth pointing out because we can lose sight of this, right, very easily. And as a third party who wants to build a very strong relationship and partnership with our institutions in implementation, this is something that I feel like it's so easy to see, but it's worth pointing out. If every weekly implementation meeting with us is spent aligning the factions across a team, we're spending less time implementing and we're spending more time just facilitating discussion that maybe should be facilitated by someone else or should be occurring separately from the meetings with us. I mean, we're always happy to be there to be a resource and whatnot, but it's just something to be aware of if you have a very strict timeline, or if you are anxious to get your launch going, these things can slow us down. If your institution does not have the people or teams designated to discuss, determine, and implement the goals and changes needed for implementation, we're far more likely to spin our wheels much longer than really needed. I like to encourage, if it's applicable and if it's possible, your team may need to meet separately from us to align and present a united vision to the implementation meetings to ensure that we're progressing, we're still moving forward, and we're not having circular discussions. Similarly, you can have a team that is aligned. Awesome. We're making progress. Now let's talk about timelines, right? So do we have a common goal with an agreed upon timeline? Because I've noticed this where some groups, while everyone may be on the same page for the goal, some groups feel this is super urgent, we got to get going, this is top priority for me. And other groups within that project team, this would be nice to have. I like the goal, I agree with it, I want it, but this is like my third priority. This is my, second from the bottom priority. And so that makes a difference in the urgency that I feel from the team while we're working. And I will say, if there's little to no urgency, implementation moves at a snail's pace, sometimes even to the point where we say, should we be meeting? Because it seems as though the team is not in agreement upon this timeline. And we're coming back to this call every time saying no progress was done from the implementation team. And so we're continually meeting with no updates. And I think every single implementation or project management team has seen this, right? There's an adage called Parkinson's Law, which is that work expands to fill the time allotted. And so put simply, the amount of work that's required seems to adjust to fill in the time available for its completion. So if we don't have that date, if we don't have that urgency, I mean, we're stretching it out. And so we're taking so much longer than we should. And it's honestly costing resources on both sides that we don't want to, right? We want to be able to put in a more efficient process for you and get you to that place of seeing your ROI from acquire or from joining the CM team. All right. And then switching gears, I want to talk a little bit about change management. So like I mentioned before, change management is often disregarded or merely kind of an afterthought tacked on to the end of the project. But if you are changing the thought process around curriculum management and impacting the actions that need to be taken by multiple people, I feel as though change management really should be at the forefront of your mind. And so I want to kick off this part of the session with a few quotes. So if you want to make enemies, try changing something. Does anyone know who said this? Any guesses on who said this? You can drop it into the chat. I'll give you a hint. It's a president. No takers? No history buffs? All right. So this was President Woodrow Wilson. And the full quote is from his address to the Salesmanship Congress in Detroit, Michigan. The full quote is, if you want to make enemies, try to change something. You know why it is. To do things today exactly the way that you did them yesterday saves thinking. It does not cost you anything. You have not acquired the habit, or you have already acquired the habit. You know the routine. You do not have to plan anything. And it frightens you with a hint of exertion to learn that you will have to do a different way tomorrow. And this quote makes me so sad. And it should make you sad too, because implementation means change, right? So we know that change has to happen. And so the next quote illustrates where I think we need to get to when it comes to, the approach for change. So change is hard because people overestimate the value of what they have, and they underestimate the value of what they may gain by giving that up. Any guesses as to who said this? The only hint that I have for you is that it's not a president. All right, so this quote came from Dr. James Velasco and Ralph Strayer, and this is from their book Flight of the Buffalo. And from this quote, I love it in its entirety, but there's just 5 words that I like to focus on specifically from this quote. Change because of the value, right? So we know it's hard. We know it's hard because they don't know what they're going to be gaining from it. And so when we talk about change and when we're explaining this to other teams or our actual end users, we need to remember why we're changing, remember why we're implementing CM, and then we should be sharing that, and we should be oversharing that over and over and over again, because I think I've heard that it takes a human being, an adult human being, hearing something 7 times before they remember it well. And so we should be constantly reminding, what is that vision that we have? Why are we changing? And so with that said, I want to quickly go over ADKAR. It's my favorite change management model because it's so simple and it's easy to remember. So first things first. Oh, one of our slides disappeared. I'm sorry about that. So awareness, right? Incredibly powerful. It's common sense to just understand that we need to be aware of a change that is coming, but it's miraculous to me almost how many institutions that I've worked with, and even changes that I've tried to implement and realize I completely skipped over the awareness part of ADKAR. The people who are affected by this change don't even know that it's coming because I skipped forward all the way to training them, right? And what good is training them if they have no idea why or that this change is actually occurring? Sorry, my slides are not loading for some reason. So you're missing out on all the GIFs and pictures that I put in for this part. And so I apologize. But the second part of ADKAR, the D, represents the desire, right? And again, just like the awareness, if we skip over this desire part, go straight into just training them, what good is that? They've trained it and maybe they know how to do something, but why do they care? If they don't want to make this change, if they don't want to, follow this new process, they might not, and they might fall back onto old habits or old patterns or old processes because to them it worked. So why did you change this for me, right? I feel as though I want to really emphasize the add part of ADKAR, just because I feel like those are so often skipped. And so with your projects team, I want to make sure that you are addressing why you're changing. Is there a very real and shared desire across this team alone in changing and making these changes and implementing this and helping others to understand this vision and this change that we are making? And then, beyond that, in terms of engagement, what is our plan for user adoption and sustainability? Are we involving end users in this implementation? Who is that? When are they involved? And do they get a say in the final decisions? I find that it is really important to have end user testing, but there is an art to it, right? There's a time where it makes the most sense to bring them in. There's times where it's too early, or there's too many people, or we don't have the right people involved for that end user testing. And so this is something that I feel it changes with each institution. So there's not a one size fits all, but all of these questions need to be addressed and answered as we move throughout the change management plan. Ugh, I'm so sad that my pictures are not showing. I'm so sorry, everyone. I might try to refresh it and see if it works, but no pictures, unfortunately. All right, moving on. So knowledge is not one that I feel like I need, or feel like this is a piece of ADKAR that I need to spend a lot of time on, because so often most institutions skip right to the knowledge part, which is that training part of, all right, we made all the changes. Now let me show you how to get into the system and do the thing. So like I said, it's common sense. Everyone knows that this part needs to happen. And so they already address this. Just don't forget all the things that come before and after it to make it meaningful. All right, so ability. This is where you've trained them, they have that knowledge, they have the concept down perhaps, and so they understand it conceptually, mentally perhaps, but have they had the time to practice it? And so when it comes to training, we will take a train the trainer model. And so it is really important that your team, your implementation team, designates trainers and these power users and kind of the resources that your end users are going to have, because when they practice, they are going to run into something where they don't understand what to do, or they aren't sure if what they did is correct. And so, have we set up the right resources for them to reach out and say, hey, I could use some help with this, or could you walk me through, could we practice together? And so during implementation, when we talk about a change management plan, we'll talk about these things to try to make sure that there is a plan in place for these things. And then lastly, reinforcement. Reinforcement is simply just making sure that you are reinforcing that the change is happening and that users are following it, right? And for those of you who have also purchased catalog in addition to curriculum management, the nice thing about that is catalog by nature is kind of a reinforcement, right? You can't really change the course and how it appears to student facing or to auditors in the catalog without changing it and following the processes that exist inside of curriculum management. So together, those things kind of help to reinforce that just simply by the nature of the product's functionality. But separately from that, there should also be a way for your team to find ways to reinforce it, whether it's reward, recognition, things like that, really hammer in home these changes to cement them and make them permanent. All right, we got through part 2. So all we have left is part 3, which is I want to walk through a couple of scenarios with you and kind of talk about the possible hurdles that I might suspect would come up for different implementation customers. All right, so let's walk through these 3 different scenarios. So we have customer ABC, our first scenario. They're an institution that's moving from a previous system with robust templates. And so they're pretty standardized. Their end users are super involved. They are there during those implementation calls, and they have a lot to say about the forms that we are building. A lot of opinions are being shared. The institution has also shared with us that they are implementing a new learning management system. All right, so that's customer ABC, our first customer. Our second customer, customer 123, this institution is moving from Word documents to CM. So forms are not templatized across the institution. So at preliminary glance, we're seeing a lot of different templates that they're using, a lot of different terminology, and there's really no standardization across the institution. End users are not involved in testing, but they have selected power users who are receiving kind of monthly updates during implementation, right? Showing them, this is what we've done so far in the form, this is how it's looking, but no testing. And as far as we know, there are no other large software implementations ongoing for the institution. And then our last customer, customer Do Re Mi, this institution is moving from a previous system that has some loose standardization, some loose template reinforcements happening. Nothing too strict, but some guidance there. End users are going to be asked to test their form after the implementation team has done their first iteration, their first draft of the form, right? So actual end users will get into the system, test it out, give some feedback. And then they've also shared with us that the institution is also implementing a new student information system. So these are our 3 customers that I want to take a look at. And I want to talk about the possible hurdles that we are going to be running into each one of these. So these are some hurdles that I've kind of narrowed down to just a few, and I want to take a look at them one by one, and please feel free to drop it into the chat. But looking at customer ABC, so our first customer who has robust templates, end users who are involved in the form building, they're on the actual implementation calls giving feedback as we build, and who are also implementing a brand new learning management system. Of these possible hurdles that are listed on the screen, what do you think are the hurdles that we are going to run into? And I'll pause for just a second to see if we have some thoughts dropped to the chat. Are we going to have too many cooks, too many opinions happening? Are we going to have the problem of death by 1,000 paper cuts where we're making, little changes constantly to the form? Are we going to go back to the drawing board because end users, when they finally use it, are unhappy with it? Or Are our resources going to be stretched thin, or are we going to have messy source data? All right, so Kara thinks we're going to have too many cooks in the kitchen. I would agree 100% with that one. Definitely too many cooks. Resources stretched thin. Yep. I would agree with that. All right, so when I looked at this scenario, I agreed. I would say too many cooks in the kitchen, the resources being stretched thin as well. I also felt as though we are going to have that problem of death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Because we have so many opinions coming in, and they're all in that implementation call, and they're giving us this feedback of, I don't like the wording on this one. Let's change that. Oh, wait. I liked that actually. Let's go back. And so we're constantly making these iterations over and over again, and it feels like progress suddenly starts to stagnate because we are stuck on some of those tiny little details. So it's something to consider when you have end users involved in the actual form building. Like I said, it's important to have end users in the system and testing and giving feedback, but there is such a thing as too early, and there is such a thing as too much feedback where we're overwhelmed and we're not able to move forward. All right. So looking at our second customer 123, they are coming from Word docs with no standardization really to their forms. They are not involving end users. Power users are getting updates, but no actual testing, and no other software implementations are ongoing. So thoughts on the hurdles that they're going to run into? All right, we got messy source data. Absolutely, 100%. Anything else that we think we'd run into? The back to the drawing board. Yep, I think that's definitely one that we're going to see as well. Yep, so exactly, you guys nailed it. Right, if we don't have end users testing things by the time that we launch, there is the possibility that end users get in there, they start using the form and they say, what is this? None of this is what I expected, or I don't understand this section. I don't want to fill this out. I really hate it, or I'm going to even try to skip it because I don't understand or like it. And so it's really important that you do have end users coming in, like I said, maybe not too early, but get them involved at some point to make sure that we are getting the form to a place where end users are actually going to like and want to use it. And then, of course, like Kara said, messy source data. If your forms or if your data is coming from Word docs and there really was no standardization, getting that into CM can be very tricky. It's not easy for us to do this programmatically, and if we're doing this manually, there might be a lot of data to get through where we say, we don't care about this. This isn't important, or it shouldn't have been filled out this way. And so that adds a lot of work to both our team and to your team. So just something to be aware of when you're looking at the timelines and expectations for this. And then last customer Do Re Mi, who has loose standardization. Their end users are testing after the first iteration, and they are implementing a new SIS. Any thoughts on the hurdles that they're going to run into? Too much going on. Definitely too much going on. Probably resources are stretched too thin. Yeah, let's talk about this. And this one was interesting, even for me, as I thought about this. Absolutely, resources are stretched too thin. Their source data might be a little bit messy because they don't have enough standardization to guarantee that their data is going to be clean. Back to the drawing board was something that I originally had, but I actually removed it because I think this could go either way, where they do have end users testing. So that's a good sign, right? We're not going to launch without some end user input. But at the same time, we have to be careful about that timing and that expectation about that first iteration, right? Is this baked enough that by the time we have end users looking at it, they're not going to have pages upon pages of feedback where we have to go back to the drawing board and start all over again. And so that is something that's a little bit of that art that I mentioned before that we just have to be careful about. All right. Perfect. I love the feedback. I love the chat, what's going on in the chat. So please, let's keep that alive and let's keep that alive in the online community. So if you haven't logged in, definitely head there. All right. And I know we're basically about out of time. So that's really everything that I wanted to go over. And just a pro tip that came with this session. So if you are already implemented, consider, doing or planning a review of your forms and your workflows to see if there's any opportunities that we can seize upon to improve and gain more efficiencies for your process. And then, of course, share your ideas, best practices that have worked for you, that you've discovered, that you've tested out in our online user community in Zendesk. And that's really everything that I had for you. So thank you so much for attending this session. And as always, we welcome your feedback. So please rate this session in Socio. But it has been a pleasure presenting for you. So thanks, everyone.